Now it's time for Document. Tonight, Mike Thompson investigates the case of Alice's annulment, the story of a wife who claimed that her husband was not up to the task required of him. The documents are old and venerable, but the language is fairly explicit about the problem to be overcome. Mike Thompson and the case of Alice's annulment.
Dicet quod ipsa jurata in quadam alter camera infra habitatione Johannae Bulbo Fischigate. The said witness says that she was present in a certain high chamber within the house of Joan Bulmer in Fischigate in the city of York.
Our document is more than 500 years old and concerns an unusual case brought before the Church Court in York. Pippa Hoskin, an historian at the Borthwick Institute, translates from the Latin.
Alexando osculabantur eidem quae Johanni, diversa verba iociosa loquibantur. She embraced the same John around his neck and kissed him.
Before we go any further, I must warn you that tonight's document is a tad rude. Perhaps sensibly it's kept behind locked doors at the very beautiful Guild Hall of St Anthony the Hermit, part of the University of York, home since 1953 of a great wealth of ecclesiastical documents and public records which make up the Borthwick Papers.
Right, and here we are. These are the documents
those
themselves.
are pretty yellowed, aren't they?
These are from a 1433 case, so they're 15th century documents. And you can see these two pieces here. They're made of parchment, so based on animal skin. You can see that the hands are very cramped, written very quickly.
Why would they have been kept all this time?
We don't really know. It may just have been an accident. No one got round to throwing them away.
Weren't they rather shocked by all this?
No, there's no sign that anyone was shocked. The historians, we aren't shocked.
I'd always assumed that was also true of hardened hacks, until I came across our document, which contains some rather racy witness statements that were brought before the church or consistory court in 1433. Back in medieval times, there was only one place to go if you wanted to catch up with the sauciest sins, and that was the church courts. Here, all manner of cases were heard, and the majority of them were instigated by women. Victor Tunkel, secretary of the Selden Society, founded in 1887 to advance the study of the history of English law, told me how this important network of courts came about.
It was William the Conqueror who did a deal with the Pope and gave the Church its own courts in this country, and they had sole jurisdiction over questions like marriage, right down till, in the case of divorce, till 1857.
But in the 1430s, divorce was only open to a very select few who were rich and powerful enough to gain one through Act of Parliament. The only option for everyone else was either a legal separation or annulment. One of the commonest grounds for annulment was impotency. The same law still stands that a marriage is not a marriage until the man has had full sexual intercourse with his wife. If it can be proved that the man is not up to this, the marriage legally never existed. This was how one Alice Russell of Leppington planned to ditch her husband, John Scaithlock, in 1433. Pippa Hoskin talked me through the paperwork.
We've got two sets of witness accounts here. Now, this first set is concerned with the couple Alice and John, and that they actually are married. You can't seek an annulment for a marriage unless you can prove that there's been a marriage in the first place.
Makes sense.
And we've also got another set of witness accounts which would have been brought as evidence before the court. And this is the evidence of 7 women who, nearly 2 years ago, had come across John Scaithlock, taken him to an upper room in Fischigate, which is a suburb just outside the main city of York. And each of them gives their individual, detailed account of what went on. So the accounts differ slightly, but in the main basis, they're all going to be the same.
I, Isabel Harwood, am 30 years old. I was present at the inspection of the body and limbs of the said John. This is the evidence of Margaret Best. I am 50 years old. The said John loosened his breeches and let them drop to his knees. revealing his penis and his testicles.
Oh, yes, I'll be coming back to that. The historian Amy Erickson has written a book called Women and Property in Early Modern England. She's an expert on how women have used the law to get a better deal from life. But can she tell me why John went along with this somewhat intimate ordeal? What was in it for him, apart from heaps of humiliation?
He clearly was willing. He was perfectly agreeable to go into the upper room and eat cakes and drink ale and have himself fondled. That was fine with him. And I think there must have been some sort of good understanding between him and Alice that things were not working out.
The church courts weren't daft. They were shrewd enough to know that married couples wanting to part might cook up an impotency allegation to win an annulment. After all, this wheeze had been tried by others before, though it sometimes backfired. Amy Erickson again.
There was one case that I know of earlier in the 14th century where an annulment was granted on grounds of the husband's impotence, and he went on to marry and have a child, at which point he was ordered to remarry the first wife. There's a case in York 50 years earlier of a woman who asks for an annulment on grounds of impotence, and the husband objects, and he will not submit to this examination. And in fact, he abducts his wife. He tries to coerce her into dropping the case, and she refuses. She continues with the case. Because he won't submit to an examination, she is granted an annulment on grounds of impotence, and the husband appeals to Rome. And in fact, he sets off for Rome to go and take the case, but he dies in Avignon on the way.
Case dismissed. But what about Alice and John? What do we know about them? There are no parish records, no wills and no diaries. But Pippa Hoskin has been busy.
We know that they both lived in a little village just outside, 10 miles outside York, so about a day's ride into York. We know that Alice was in her mid-20s when she married. That's quite normal in York at this date. There seems to have been partly a lack of men to marry. There is a population problem after the Black Death in 1348, when a third of the population's been wiped out. Population in England hasn't really recovered. Because there's a lack of population, there are too few people for the jobs, young people have more opportunities to work. So Alice could have chosen to work as a servant for a few years, either because she wants to raise money for her dowry that way, or just because she wants to work. And some women in York were even working as barber surgeons. Anything you bring in, once you've married, is your husband's.
So at that time then, a woman didn't really have to marry purely for financial purposes?
Not in the way that many people think about medieval women marrying for financial purposes, but of course there is the problem of your old age. You may feel that you need to marry to have the children to look after you in your old age.
So, a remarkably modern dilemma. A woman could delay getting married whilst she built up her career, or even choose not to get married at all. But there was a catch. Her children were her pension. The need to have children was a need the church understood. Whatever Alice might have really been feeling, it was safest to say that her husband's inability to father children lay at the root of her action. So Alice had to make out that this was her motive. But what of the church's motive in all of this? Why did it spend so much time and effort listening to stories like hers?
The church was certainly trying to get hold of marriage from perhaps the 11th century on, and certainly from the 13th century. They're issuing statutes saying you must marry in a church. Now, not everyone was doing that, and the church courts recognised that. They would prefer you to go through the churches because the health of people's souls could depend upon this.
And as such, the business of being called as a witness was taken very seriously indeed.
You got 3 chances to obey the instructions to come. If you didn't, you were excommunicated. So you're being put outside the church, and that's very serious in the 15th century.
OK, let's get down to the nitty-gritty. What exactly did the examination entail? Well, I hope you're ready for this.
John has gone to a house in Fishergate, to an upper room there where we know there's going to be food and drink, big fire, and 7 women. Joan Seymour, and Joan Seymour's aged 40. There's Joan Tunstall, she's 36. There's Isabel Harwood, she's about 30. Joan Bank is 26, she's the youngest there. Margaret Bell is the oldest at 50. and then Isabel Grimthorpe and Joan Lawrence, also both in their 40s. Now, we don't know much about these 7 women, but we do know that they're going to carry out what they later call an examination of John, but it's possibly an attempt to cure, really.
I and the other women served the same John and ate and drank with him and joked with him and used friendly words with him, and with our hands warmed at the fire, we rubbed his... I and the other women in turn rubbed the said penis and testicles with hands warmed at the fire, and showed me breasts to the same John, and embraced and frequently kissed him, and with friendly words urged him for shame to show us his virility, if he was a man.
One of them even undresses, loosens her clothes and pushes him down on a bed and gets on top of him. And all the time, all of them are saying to him, "Show us you're a man." But eventually, they're getting to the stage where they think this just isn't going anywhere. We're not getting anywhere. They say nothing's happening.
For the whole time of the inspection, his penis remained soft and hung between his legs, neither growing nor shrinking, but staying in the same state,
lacking all strength and hardness, scarcely longer than 3 inches, neither increasing nor decreasing.
And they say, "Have you ever slept with a woman? Have you ever slept with your wife?" And he admits to them that he never has. Never has. At this point, they're angry.
We cursed him that he should dare to take as a wife a young woman when he was able to serve and please her no better than this.
And they walk out on him.
I swear that the said John was and is impotent.
They all go down the stairs. They leave him in the room. They failed.
Let's just examine this bizarre test.
Philip Hodson is a psychosexual counsellor and chairman of the Impotency Association. He's outraged.
You've got a bloke that has been labelled, at least by one person, as a sexual failure. Now, he may himself also see it that way, although he shouldn't, because it's perfectly normal not to be able to get an erection under conditions of pressure. And what have we created? We've got 7 women partially stripping, partially teasing, saying, "Go on, can you do it to me, boy?" We've got them playing with him sexually, touching him up, so to speak, and we know that actually that is often counterproductive. So there is every sense in which this particular chap, John, should not, in my professional view, have been able to get an erection under these conditions. It's the worst situation you could probably put him in. It's as if a bloke were a machine or a 2-speed power drill. You know, just press the button, put the electricity in, and of course he's revolving or extending or whatever the case may be. And that's phooey. That's absolute bunk.
I think they're trying to be friendly. They're trying to get a comfortable environment with a fire and beer. Obviously, the beer might have had the reverse effect eventually, but I don't feel that they're trying to intimidate him.
Historian and archivist Pamela Taylor believes our ladies were merely being neighbourly.
I guess what happened was she said to her friends and neighbours, "I have a problem here." And they discussed what to do about it and did this in order to have the evidence that this was the nature of the problem. It was obviously a fairly jolly occasion.
Indeed, and beer was flowing, buns were out.
And it was warm. I love the detail about keeping their hands warm. I think that's very sensitive.
How we view what happened to John depends very much on who we think these 7 women were, and whether they were motivated by kindness or cash. Philip Hodson.
I was reading a document about Richard, Duke of York, before he became Richard III, and he was asked by Lord Hastings, "Are there any good whorehouses in York?" And he said, "Several, my lord." Now, maybe that's where these women came from. They came from the local knocking shop. So they might well be hardened hussies who, like many prostitutes, can be quite cruel with men's feeblenesses.
These witnesses are of free status and of good standing.
This is how our document describes these women. It seems pretty unequivocal to modern ears that they couldn't have been shameless hussies. But then you learn that this form of words was a rather meaningless courtesy title, like me calling you my good sir. It's more a form of address than a statement about your morality or social status.
It's more likely that these are women who are perhaps not professional prostitutes, because one at least of them is described as a seamstress, but women who are on the margins of York society. They're women who perhaps sometimes enter prostitution to earn a bit more money. They're not women who are considered particularly important or decent within York because they're not members of the Corpus Christi Guild at this date. Lots of single and married women are. In fact, almost anyone who's anyone in York, anyone respectable is, and none of these women appear there.
Hang on a minute, Pippa, says Amy Erickson.
I don't think the church court would have accepted the testimony of prostitutes. I don't think that Alice would have asked prostitutes to examine John, actually. I don't think she would have wanted that, probably. I don't know if she would have known where to find prostitutes, how to go about contacting them. There's all sorts of questions there. So I think they were local, reputable women in York who would have had experience of marital relations and knew what to do to try to arouse John.
So, possibly not prostitutes, but wise old women of the world. Victor Tunkel says the clue is in the number of temptresses. From biblical times, the number 7 has been a highly significant one for the Church.
The common method of proof in the church courts generally is what was called canonical compurgation, which is a long-winded way of saying that the parties could produce 7 oath helpers, and that was very often sufficient in many cases. But if the allegations had to be scrutinised more closely, well then the jury of matrons, 7 women of mature years and knowing the facts of life, examined the wife's own sexual organs, and if they pronounced her a virgin, then that would be sufficient to have the marriage annulled. And there are some cases where the jury of matrons were allowed to examine the husband's sexual organs and even to see whether he could be aroused, and if he wasn't able to, then of course that would be clear evidence that the marriage would have to be annulled.
So perhaps our 7 women were indeed professionals. Not prostitutes, but a local chapter, so to speak, of the jury of 7 matrons. But there's a nagging doubt in my mind. I want to show our document to a woman with some insider knowledge. My journey takes me from the rarefied splendours of York to the stick-of-rock vendors of a South Coast resort.
Hello, Mike Thompson, BBC.
And welcome to Bognor Regis.
Despite lacking in luncheon vouchers, I asked Britain's best-known madam, Cynthia Payne, to cast her expert eyes over my document. Does she think these were merely respectable women lending a hand?
You would have a hell of a job to find 7 women like that, wouldn't you? No. I would think it's easier to get prostitutes to do it, but I've met a lot of ordinary enthusiastic amateurs, but I suppose prostitutes for X number of pounds would get on and do the job.
How do you think you might have done this? If someone had come to you and said, look, could you devise a test to find out whether or not this man, John, is impotent or not?
I wouldn't put him with 7 ladies, I might put him with 2. Why didn't they do it 7 times separately with 1 lady in a private room? Why in front of everybody else?
I think they wanted lots of witnesses should it happen. No cameras being around in those days.
Yeah, I suppose it had to be like that, but I don't think it was good enough proof. Some men can do it with group sex, but they're going to be that way inclined. But he probably knows, at the back of his mind, he knows what it's all being done for. Because the mind controls the body, doesn't it? You almost want to see photographs of John, you know, because you can tell a lot by a photograph. Well, I know, okay, roughly. He might have been a big, heavy man. I'd like to think of him as a big, heavy 6-footer with a lot of weight. Little men, wiry men with no fat on them. They're right little goers, can't get rid of them. But a big, heavy 6-footer, a jolly sort.
A jolly sort?
There's a possibility that he was gay, and probably that's why he wanted to get out of the marriage.
Now there's a thought. After all, the document does say of Alice...
Alice is sufficiently pretty and scarcely 26.
I'll put this one to Pamela Taylor.
It had crossed my mind to wonder what would have happened if it had been youths in the room as well as some women. But 2 things. The first is this was not a question that was at all necessary to ask because it was irrelevant. You don't care why he's impotent, you just want to know that he is impotent and therefore they cannot possibly have had intercourse. The other thing is it would have been very dangerous if John had been found to be homosexual because this was a persecuting church. There was no liberalism about homosexuality, at least formally. So it would have been a dangerous question to ask. So I'm very glad they didn't ask it.
After all, sodomy was punishable by death. Meanwhile, many months have passed. Alice's proctor, her solicitor in effect, has gathered in all the witness statements. We have now reached what was grandly called the day to compound all acts. Here we confirm that John's proctor has seen all the evidence too and decided not to make a counter-claim. Remember, in medieval law, John can't defend himself in court or cross-examine witnesses. The only way that his side of the story can be heard is if he makes a very costly counter-claim. But it appears he hasn't done that. So now all we can do is wait for the judge to decide. The decision will be announced in the church court, held in the truly awe-inspiring York Minster. There's no evidence that Alice and John actually travelled to the Minster to hear the verdict, but when Pippa takes me, I can almost feel their presence, their struggle. Or was it more my struggle?
So this door is probably the same one, or could be the same one, that John and Alice would have walked through. Unfortunately, it's locked, so we'll try another one. Oh, yes. Looking better by the second. We're on the trail.
Glasses, please, before you go onto the floor.
Right. Some official details need taken care of first.
But, the system works in the Minster.
So we finally get through this large door and into the cathedral itself.
This is the north transept. This is where the courts would have been.
Right where we're standing now?
Yeah, right where we're standing now.
You certainly would feel like you're going to the highest authority, wouldn't you, coming here?
You would. It may have seemed quite a small wooden area, but if you look up above us,
just goes
it's a very...
and on up there, doesn't it?
Yes. The whole Minster and the way it looks talks about the power of the church, what the church can do for you.
As we await the verdict, Pippa speculates on what was at stake for Alice.
Obviously, to Alice, the annulment is very important because she's put an awful lot of money and effort into this case. And she knows if she loses, she's going to have to pay a large amount of money, or the couple are going to have to pay a large amount of money. It's perhaps very important to her to marry a particular person. As we said, it may just be very important to her to have the chance to have children.
So let's deal with John then. What's going through his mind?
For John, the important thing about this case is if this marriage is annulled, he probably isn't going to be able to marry again. If he is held to be sort of naturally impotent, then he is not going to be able to make a canonically acceptable marriage. Any marriage he made has the potential to be annulled.
Just say Alice had taken a different course before we get to the verdict. What if she had thought to herself, let's not cause a fuss, let's not cause embarrassment and indeed a great amount of expense. Instead of that, if I find myself a lover, if children, or the lack of them, is the root problem of all this, then how would this be received by the local population?
Yes, that's an interesting point to speculate upon. I suspect it might have depended on how much people did know before she actually came to the courts. If John is prepared to admit that he's impotent, that these couldn't be his children, he could then get a separation from Alice on the grounds of adultery. And if the husband, not the wife, has brought a separation case, she doesn't get any money. So she would be cut off without any sort of income at all. In an annulment case, she won't have walked away with money because the marriage has been completely annulled. It didn't happen. She doesn't have any claim on John. John doesn't have any claim on her.
Well, the big day is here. John and Alice and possibly the 7 temptresses are also here in York Minster, and they're waiting for the sentence, the news of what the judge has decided. What would be happening here on that day?
The judge is going to read out the full sentence, and the important thing is that he's declaring it. It's the actual speaking of this judgment that matters. It doesn't actually stand as valid unless it's been declared publicly.
I solemnly do declare that John, so made by nature, is impotent and unable to know Alice or any other woman carnally. Therefore, Alice, without guilt, is justified in her case.
This is the verdict that Alice wants. It's certainly what she's hoped for and what she came to the courts to get.
So Alice can simply walk out that door and get married again.
Yes.
I think that the verdict itself is a farce.
Philip Hodson believes the judgment shames the whole church court system, and even though 500 years have passed, it still makes him angry.
The verdict does not relate to the evidence. The evidence does not support the verdict. If this man were alive in 2002 and came to my consulting rooms, we would run tests. One might be to give him Viagra and see if it worked. Another would be to see whether he has nocturnal tumescence. The cheapest way to test that is to put a link of postage stamps around the man's penis at night and see if it's been broken the next day.
But it seems that when it comes to the potential for public humiliation, John had it easy compared to his counterparts in impotency cases across the Channel at the time. Victor Tunkel.
In France, these trials became quite a spectacle, and the courtrooms had to be enlarged in order to cope with the number of people who wanted to come and watch. They went further than the Alice case because they required the parties actually to have effective intercourse, if they were able to, before your very eyes, ultimately proving whether it was possible or not. And you have the judge there to decide whether effective congress, as they call it, has taken place.
The laws on annulment are still in place, even though they are now governed by secular rather than church courts. And here's an interesting thing. In our multicultural society, where arranged marriages are becoming more common, so too, once again, are requests for annulments. It seems we've turned full circle. Helen Howard is a matrimonial lawyer and author of The Witch Guide to Divorce.
Amazingly, in last year, 2001, which is the last year that there were statistics available for, the numbers of nullity petitions shot up by 45% to 657. Now, that didn't all translate into nullity decrees. That was just over half. But the sort of people who nowadays apply for a nullity petition would be, for example, a couple whose parents had arranged their marriage. They've gone through a state ceremony, having known very little about one another. The marriage hasn't been consummated, and then the plan would be that they would have a religious ceremony later on down the line. In the meantime, they get to know one another, fall out, and decide that they're not going to go ahead.
So, what have we learnt from our document? Sometimes I felt that those I've asked to interpret it have been looking into a deep well and seeing a faint image of themselves gazing back. But for Pippa Hoskin, the picture is clear and sharply focused.
The value of this document is as an example of the way women are using the church courts. The equality of purpose that women can have in the courts, the chance they have, which they don't have so much in the secular courts, to bring their own cases as they choose to.
So it shows that women weren't as downtrodden at that period as we might assume.
In terms of the church courts, in terms of the church and the way that they were viewing women in legal terms, no, they're not.
The fact remains is he couldn't get a hard on.
Cynthia Payne putting a full stop to a document that was rather more risque than usual. Alice's Annulment was written and presented by Mike Thompson, and the producer was Jane Ray.